Hold on tight for this one because we're going to dive into the history of the Mississippi appendectomy. We all know that the practices of birth control, sterilization, and other contraceptives have been a means to control our reproductive organs for decades. And with that, we need to remember that everything has a background, and history may not paint as pretty of a picture as you might think. Birthed from the eugenics movement, the practices of contraception are still controversial today. And the science and implementation of these ideas are credited to a man named Charles Davenport. You see, Davenport applied basic principles of genetics known at the time and applied to humans in an effort to prove his theory that undesirable traits such as criminality, poverty, promiscuity, and feeble-mindedness were genetically inherited. And his thought was that if you could limit the reproduction of these undesirable traits by sterilizing those who exhibited them, it would benefit the economic and social strains that the country was experiencing in the early 1900s. The first sterilization law was accepted in Indiana in 1907, and a total of 31 states had forced sterilization laws on their books until 1978. And the targets back then? Well, of course, more often than not, they were Black women whose race and societal standings were used as a tool to subjugate them. And a result of this was that through the 1920s through the 1980s, in some parts of the South, the phenomenon known as the Mississippi appendectomy was created. The Mississippi appendectomy was a medical practice that provided involuntary sterilization to poor Black women who were deemed unfit to reproduce. The term itself was popularized by civil rights activist Fannie Lou Hamer, who wanted to bring awareness to this issue because she herself had experienced this. You see, when she went in for a routine tumor removal by a white doctor, he also removed her uterus. It was later discovered that this was a regular practice among physicians in Mississippi who wanted to keep the Black population in check. During this time, such states as North Carolina, South Carolina, and Mississippi saw upwards of 8,000 sterilizations, 85% of which were women, and 40% of those were women of color. In Dorothy Roberts' book, Killing the Black Body, she says, during the 1970s, sterilization became the most rapidly growing form of birth control in the United States, rising from 200,000 cases in 1970 to over 700,000 cases in 1980. It was a common belief among Blacks in the South, and Black women were routinely sterilized without their informed consent and for no valid medical reason. Teaching hospitals performed unnecessary hysterectomies on poor Black women as a practice for their medical residents. When Elaine Riddick here was 14, she was sexually assaulted by her neighbor and fell pregnant, and her social worker recommended her to be sterilized. She found out about the sterilization about 5 years later and was one of the first people in North Carolina to speak up about it. Since the end of the eugenics movement, only 7 states have run programs to apologize to its victims.